The Inn of the Two Witches. A Find. Joseph Conrad. This tale, episode, experience, call it how you will, was related in the 50s of the last century by a man who, by his own confession, was 60 years old at the time. 60 is not a bad age, unless in perspective, when no doubt it is contemplated by the majority of us with mixed feelings. It is a calm age. The game is practically over by then, and standing aside, one begins to remember with a certain vividness what a fine fellow one used to be. I have observed that, by an amiable attention of Providence, most people at 60 begin to take a romantic view of themselves. Their very failures exhale a charm of peculiar potency. And indeed, the hopes of the future are a fine company to live with, exquisite forms, fascinating if you like, but, so to speak, naked, stripped for a run. The robes of glamour are luckily the property of the immovable past, which, without them, would sit, a shivery sort of thing, under the gathering shadows. I suppose it was the romanticism of growing age which set our man to relate his experience for his own satisfaction or for the wonder of his posterity. It could not have been for his glory, because the experience was simply that of an abominable fright. Terror, he calls it. You would have guessed that the relation alluded to in the very first lines was in writing. This writing constitutes the find declared in the subtitle. The title itself is my own contrivance, can't call it invention, and has the merit of veracity. We will be concerned with an inn here. As to the witches, that's merely a conventional expression, and we must take our man's word for it that it fits the case. The find was made in a box of books bought in London, in a street which no longer exists, from a second-hand bookseller in the last stage of decay. As to the books themselves, they were at least 20th hand, and on inspection turned out not worth the very small sum of money I disbursed. It might have been some premonition of that fact which made me say, "But I must have the box too." The decayed bookseller assented by the careless, tragic gesture of a man already doomed to extinction. A litter of loose pages at the bottom of the box excited my curiosity, but faintly. The close, neat, regular handwriting was not attractive at first sight. But in one place, the statement that in AD 1813 the writer was 22 years old caught my eye. 22 is an interesting age in which one is easily reckless and easily frightened, the faculty of reflection being weak and the power of imagination strong. In another place, the phrase, "At night we stood in again," arrested my languid attention because it was a sea phrase. Let's see what it is all about, I thought, without excitement. Oh, but it was a dull-faced MS, each line resembling every other line in their close-set and regular order. It was like the drone of a monotonous voice, a treatise on sugar refining, the dreariest subject I can think of, could have been given a more lively appearance. In AD 1813, I was 22 years old, he begins earnestly, and goes on with every appearance of calm, horrible industry. Don't imagine, however, that there is anything archaic in my find. Diabolic ingenuity in invention, though as old as the world is by no means a lost art. Look at the telephones for shattering the little peace of mind given to us in this world, or at the machine guns for letting with dispatch life out of our bodies. Now, a days any blare-eyed old witch, if only strong enough to turn an insignificant little handle, could lay low 100 young men of 20 in the twinkling of an eye. If this isn't progress, why immense? We have moved on, and so you must expect to meet here a certain naiveness of contrivance and simplicity of aim appertaining to the remote epoch. And of course, no motoring tourist can hope to find such an inn anywhere now. This one, the one of the title, was situated in Spain. That much I discovered only from internal evidence, because a good many pages of that relation were missing. Perhaps not a great misfortune after all. The writer seemed to have entered into a most elaborate detail of the why and wherefore of his presence on that coast, presumably the north coast of Spain. His experience has nothing to do with the sea, though. As far as I can make it out, he was an officer on board a sloop of war. There's nothing strange in that. At all stages of the long Peninsula campaign, many of our men of war of the smaller kind were cruising off the north coast of Spain, as risky and disagreeable a station as can be well imagined. It looks as though that ship of his had had some special service to perform. A careful explanation of all the circumstances was to be expected from our man, only, as I've said, some of his pages, good tough paper too, were missing, gone in covers for jampos or in wadding for the fowling pieces of his irreverent posterity. But it is to be seen clearly that communication with the shore and even the sending of messengers inland was part of her service, either to obtain intelligence from or to transmit orders or advice to patriotic Spaniards, guerrilleros, or secret juntas of the province. Something of the sort. All this can be only inferred from the preserved scraps of his conscientious writing. Next, we come upon the panegyric of a very fine sailor, a member of the ship's company, having the rating of the captain's coxswain. He was known on board as Cuba Tom, not because he was Cuban, however. He was indeed the best type of a genuine British tar of that time, and a man-of-war's man for years. He came by the name on account of some wonderful adventures he had in that island in his young days, adventures which were the favourite subject of the yarns he was in the habit of spinning to his shipmates of an evening on the forecastle head. He was intelligent, very strong, and of proved courage. Incidentally, we are told, so exact is our narrator, that Tom had the finest pigtail for thickness and length of any man in the navy. This appendage, much cared for and sheathed tightly in a pauper's skin, hung halfway down his broad back to the great admiration of all beholders, and to the great envy of some. Our young officer dwells on the manly qualities of Cuba Tom with something like affection. This sort of relation between officer and man was not then very rare. A youngster, on joining the service, was put under the charge of a trustworthy seaman, who slung his first hammock for him, and often later on became a sort of humble friend to the junior officer. The narrator, on joining the sloop, had found this man on board after some years of separation. There is something touching in the warm pleasure he remembers and records at this meeting with the professional mentor of his boyhood. We discover then that, no Spaniard being forthcoming for the service, this worthy seaman with the unique pigtail and a very high character for courage and steadiness had been selected as messenger for one of these missions inland which have been mentioned. His preparations were not elaborate. One gloomy autumn morning, the sloop ran close to a shallow cove where a landing could be made on that iron-bound shore. A boat was lowered and pulled in with Tom Corbin, Cuba Tom, perched in the bow, and our young man, Mr. Edgar Byrne was his name on this earth which knows him no more, sitting in the stern sheets. A few inhabitants of a hamlet, whose grey stone houses could be seen 100 yards or so up a deep ravine, had come down to the shore and watched the approach of the boat. The two Englishmen leaped ashore. Either from dullness or astonishment, the peasants gave no greeting, and only fell back in silence. Mr. Byrne had made up his mind to see Tom Corbin started fairly on his way. He looked round at the heavy, surprised faces. "There isn't much to get out of them," he said. "Let us walk up to the village. There will be a wine shop for sure, where we may find somebody more promising to talk to and get some information from." "Aye, aye, sir," said Tom, falling into step behind his officer. "A bit of palaver as to courses and distances can do no harm. I crossed the broadest part of Cuba by the help of my tongue, though knowing far less Spanish than I do now. As they say themselves, it was 4 words and no more with me, that time when I got left behind on shore by the Blanche frigate." He made light of what was before him, which was but a day's journey into the mountains. It is true that there was a full day's journey before striking the mountain path, but that was nothing for a man who had crossed the island of Cuba on his 2 legs, and with no more than 4 words of the language to begin with. The officer and the man were walking now on a thick, sodden bed of dead leaves, which the peasants thereabouts accumulate in the streets of their villages to rot during the winter for field manure. Turning his head, Mr. Byrne perceived that the whole male population of the hamlet was following them on the noiseless, springy carpet. Women stared from the doors of the houses, and the children had apparently gone into hiding. The village knew the ship by sight, afar off, but no stranger had landed on that spot perhaps for 100 years or more. The cocked hat of Mr. Byrne, the bushy whiskers, and the enormous pigtail of the sailor filled them with mute wonder. They pressed behind the two Englishmen, staring like those islanders discovered by Captain Cook in the South Seas. It was then that Byrne had his first glimpse of the little cloaked man in a yellow hat. Faded and dingy as it was, this covering for his head made him noticeable. The entrance to the wine shop was like a rough hole in a wall of flints. The owner was the only person who was not in the street, for he came out from the darkness at the back where the inflated forms of wineskins hung on nails could be vaguely distinguished. He was a tall, one-eyed Asturian with scrubby, hollow cheeks. A grave expression of countenance contrasted enigmatically with the roaming restlessness of his solitary eye. On learning that the matter in hand was the sending on his way of that English mariner toward a certain Gonzales in the mountains, he closed his good eye for a moment, as if in meditation, then opened it, very lively again. Possibly. It could be done. A friendly murmur arose in the group in the doorway at the name of Gonzales, the local leader against the French. Inquiring as to the safety of the road, Byrne was glad to learn that no troops of that nation had been seen in the neighborhood for months, not the smallest little detachment of these impious polyzones. While giving these answers, the owner of the wine shop busied himself in drawing into an earthenware jug some wine which he set before the heretic English, pocketing with grave abstraction the small piece of money the officer threw upon the table in recognition of the unwritten law that none may enter a wine shop without buying drink. His eye was in constant motion as if it were trying to do the work of the two, but when Byrne made inquiries as to the possibility of hiring a mule, it became immovably fixed in the direction of the door, which was closely besieged by the curious. In front of them, just within the threshold, the little man in the large cloak and yellow hat had taken his stand. He was a diminutive person, a mere homunculus, Byrne describes him, in a ridiculously mysterious yet assertive attitude, a corner of his cloak thrown cavalierly over his left shoulder, muffling his chin and mouth, while the broad-brimmed yellow hat hung on a corner of his square little head. He stood there taking snuff repeatedly. "A mule," repeated the wine seller, his eyes fixed on that quaint and snuffy figure. "No, Senor Officer, decidedly no mule is to be got in this poor place." The coxswain, who stood by with the true sailor's air of unconcern in strange surroundings, struck in quietly. "If your honor will believe me, Shank's pony's the best for this job. I would have to leave the beast somewhere anyhow, since the captain has told me that half my way will be along paths fit only for goats." The diminutive man made a step forward, and speaking through the folds of the cloak, which seemed to muffle a sarcastic intention. "Sai, senor, they are too honest in this village to have a single mule amongst them for your worship's service. To that I can bear testimony. In these times it's only rogues or very clever men who can manage to have mules or any other four-footed beasts and the wherewithal to keep them. But what this valiant mariner wants is a guide. And here, senor, behold my brother-in-law, Bernardino, wine seller, and alcalde of this most Christian and hospitable village, who will find you one." This, Mr. Byrne says in his relation, was the only thing to do. A youth in a ragged coat and goatskin breeches was produced after some more talk. The English officer stood treat to the whole village, and while the peasants drank, he and Cuba Tom took their departure accompanied by the guide. The diminutive man in the cloak had disappeared. Byrne went along with the coxswain out of the village. He wanted to see him fairly on his way, and he would have gone a greater distance if the seaman had not suggested respectfully the advisability of return so as not to keep the ship a moment longer than necessary, so close in with the shore on such an unpromising-looking morning. A wild, gloomy sky hung over their heads when they took leave of each other, and their surroundings of rank bushes and stony fields were dreary. In 4 days' time, were Burns' last words. The ship will stand in and send a boat on shore if the weather permits. If not, you'll have to make it out on shore the best you can till we come along to take you off. Right you are, sir, answered Tom, and strode on. Burn watched him step out on a narrow path. In a thick pea-jacket with a pair of pistols in his belt, a cutlass by his side, and a stout cudgel in his hand, he looked a sturdy figure and well able to take care of himself. He turned round for a moment to wave his hand, giving to Burn one more view of his honest bronzed face with bushy whiskers. The lad in goatskin breeches looking, Burn says, like a fawn or a young satyr leaping ahead, stopped to wait for him, and then went off at a bound. Both disappeared. Burn turned back. The hamlet was hidden in a fold of the ground, and the spot seemed the most lonely corner of the earth, and as if accursed in its uninhabited, desolate barrenness. Before he had walked many yards, there appeared very suddenly from behind a bush the muffled-up, diminutive Spaniard. Naturally, Burn stopped short. The other made a mysterious gesture with a tiny hand peeping from under his cloak. His hat hung very much at the side of his head. "Senor," he said without any preliminaries, "caution. It is a positive fact that one-eyed Bernardino, my brother-in-law, has at this moment a mule in his stable. And why he who is not clever has a mule there? Because he is a rogue, a man without conscience. Because I had to give up the macho to him to secure for myself a roof to sleep under and a mouthful of olla to keep my soul in this insignificant body of mine. Yet, senor, it contains a heart many times bigger than the mean thing which beats in the breast of that brute connection of mine, of which I am ashamed, though I opposed that marriage with all my power. Well, the misguided woman suffered enough. She had her purgatory on this earth. God rest her soul." Burn says he was so astonished by the sudden appearance of that sprite-like being, and by the sardonic bitterness of the speech, that he was unable to disentangle the significant fact from what seemed but a piece of family history fired out at him without rhyme or reason. Not at first. He was confounded, and at the same time he was impressed by the rapid, forcible delivery, quite different from the frothy, excited loquacity of an Italian. So he stared while the homunculus, letting his cloak fall about him, aspired an immense quantity of snuff out of the hollow of his palm. "A mule!" exclaimed Burn, seizing at last the real aspect of the discourse. "You say he has got a mule. That's queer. Why did he refuse to let me have it?" The diminutive Spaniard muffled himself up again with great dignity. "Quien sabe?" he said coldly, with a shrug of his draped shoulders. "He is a great politico in everything he does. But one thing your worship may be certain of, that his intentions are always rascally. This husband of my defunta sister ought to have been married a long time ago to the widow with the wooden legs." "Eh, I see. But remember that, whatever your motives, your worship countenanced him in this lie." The bright, unhappy eyes on each side of a predatory nose confronted Burn without wincing, while with that testiness which lurks so often at the bottom of Spanish dignity. "No doubt the senior officer would not lose an ounce of blood if I were stuck under the fifth rib," he retorted. "But what of this poor sinner here?" Then, changing his tone, "Senor, by the necessities of the times I live here in exile, a Castilian and an old Christian, existing miserably in the midst of these brute Asturians, and dependent on the worst of them all, who has less conscience and scruples than a wolf. And being a man of intelligence, I govern myself accordingly, yet I can hardly contain my scorn. You have heard the way I spoke. A caballero of parts like your worship might have guessed that there was a cat in there." "What cat?" said Burn uneasily. "Oh, I see. Something suspicious." "No, senor, I guessed nothing. My nation are not good guessers at that sort of thing, and therefore I ask you plainly whether that wine-seller has spoken the truth in other particulars." "There are certainly no Frenchmen anywhere about," said the little man with a return to his indifferent manner. "Or robbers, ladrones. Ladrones en grande. No, assuredly not," was the answer in a cold, philosophical tone. What is there left for them to do after the French? And nobody travels in these times. But who can say? Opportunity makes the robber. Still, that mariner of yours has a fierce aspect, and with the son of a cat-rats will have no play. But there is a saying, too, that where honey is, there will soon be flies. This oracular discourse exasperated Byrne. "In the name of God," he cried, "tell me plainly if you think my man is reasonably safe on his journey." The homunculus, undergoing one of his rapid changes, seized the officer's arm. The grip of his little hand was astonishing. "Senor," Bernardino had taken notice of him. "What more do you want? And listen, men have disappeared on this road, on a certain portion of this road, when Bernardino kept a maison, an inn, and I, his brother-in-law, had coaches and mules for hire. Now there are no travellers, no coaches. The French have ruined me. Bernardino has retired here for reasons of his own after my sister died. They were three to torment the life out of her, he and Erminia and Lucilla, two aunts of his, all affiliated to the devil. And now he has robbed me of my last mule. You are an armed man. Demand the macho from him with a pistol to his head, senor. It is not his, I tell you, and ride after your man who is so precious to you. And then you shall both be safe, for no two travellers have been ever known to disappear together in these days. As to the beast, I, its owner, I confide it to your honour." They were staring hard at each other, and Byrne nearly burst into a laugh at the ingenuity and transparency of the little man's plot to regain possession of his mule. But he had no difficulty to keep a straight face, because he felt deep within himself a strange inclination to do that very extraordinary thing. He did not laugh, but his lip quivered, at which the diminutive Spaniard, detaching his black, glittering eyes from Byrne's face, turned his back on him brusquely with a gesture and a fling of the cloak, which somehow expressed contempt, bitterness, and discouragement all at once. He turned away and stood still, his hat aslant, muffled up to the ears. But he was not offended to the point of refusing the silver duro which Byrne offered him with a non-committal speech, as if nothing extraordinary had passed between them. "I must make haste on board now," said Byrne then. "Vaya usted con Dios," muttered the gnome. And this interview ended with a sarcastic low sweep of the hat, which was replaced at the same perilous angle as before. Directly the boat had been hoisted, the ship's sails were filled on the offshore tack, and Byrne imparted the whole story to his captain, who was but a very few years older than himself. There was some amused indignation at it, but while they laughed, they looked gravely at each other. A Spanish dwarf trying to beguile an officer of His Majesty's Navy into stealing a mule for him. That was too funny, too ridiculous, too incredible. Those were the exclamations of the captain. He couldn't get over the grotesqueness of it. "Incredible! That's just it," murmured Byrne at last in a significant tone. They exchanged a long stare. "It's as clear as daylight," affirmed the captain impatiently, because in his heart he was not certain. And Tom, the best seaman in the ship for one, the good-humouredly deferential friend of his boyhood for the other, was becoming endowed with a compelling fascination, like a symbolic figure of loyalty appealing to their feelings and their conscience, so that they could not detach their thoughts from his safety. Several times they went up on deck, only to look at the coast, as if it could tell them something of his fate. It stretched away, lengthening in the distance, mute, naked, and savage, veiled now and then by the slanting cold shafts of rain. The westerly swell rolled its interminable angry lines of foam, and big dark clouds flew over the ship in a sinister procession. "I wish to goodness you had done what your little friend in the yellow hat wanted you to do," said the commander of the sloop, late in the afternoon, with visible exasperation. "Do you, sir?" answered Byrne, bitter with positive anguish. "I wonder what you would have said afterwards. Why? I might have been kicked out of the service for looting a mule from a nation in alliance with His Majesty, or I might have been battered to a pulp with flails and pitchforks, a pretty tale to get abroad about one of your officers, while trying to steal a mule. or chased ignominiously to the boat, for you would not have expected me to shoot down unoffending people for the sake of a mangy mule. And yet, he added in a low voice, I almost wish myself I had done it. Before dark, those two young men had worked themselves up into a highly complex psychological state of scornful skepticism and alarmed credulity. It tormented them exceedingly, and the thought that it would have to last for 6 days at least, and possibly be prolonged further for an indefinite time, was not to be borne. The ship was therefore put on the inshore tack at dark. All through the gusty, dark night, she went towards the land to look for her man, at times lying over in the heavy puffs, at others rolling idle in the swell, nearly stationary, as if she too had a mind of her own to swing perplexed between cool reason and warm impulse. Then, just at daybreak, a boat put off from her and went on, tossed by the seas towards the shallow cove, where, with considerable difficulty, an officer in a thick coat and a round hat managed to land on a strip of shingle. It was my wish, writes Mr. Byrne, a wish of which my captain approved, to land secretly if possible. I did not want to be seen either by my aggrieved friend in the yellow hat, whose motives were not clear, or by the one-eyed wine seller, who may or may not have been affiliated to the devil, or indeed by any other dweller in that primitive village. But unfortunately, the cove was the only possible landing place for miles, and from the steepness of the ravine I couldn't make a circuit to avoid the houses. Fortunately, he goes on, all the people were yet in their beds. It was barely daylight when I found myself walking on the thick layer of sodden leaves filling the only street. No soul was stirring abroad, no dog barked. The silence was profound, and I had concluded with some wonder that apparently no dogs were kept in the hamlet when I heard a low snarl, and from a noisome alley between two hovels emerged a vile cur with its tail between its legs. He slunk off silently, showing me his teeth as he ran before me, and he disappeared so suddenly that he might have been the unclean incarnation of the evil one. There was, too, something so weird in the manner of its coming and vanishing that my spirits, already by no means very high, became further depressed by the revolting sight of this creature, as if by an unlucky presage. He got away from the coast unobserved as far as he knew, then struggled manfully to the west against wind and rain, on a barren, dark upland, under a sky of ashes. Far away, the harsh and desolate mountains, raising their scarped and denuded ridges, seemed to wait for him menacingly. The evening found him fairly near to them, but, in sailor language, uncertain of his position, hungry, wet, and tired out by a day of steady tramping over broken ground, during which he had seen very few people and had been unable to obtain the slightest intelligence of Tom Corbin's passage. On, on, I must push on, he had been saying to himself through the hours of solitary effort, spurred more by incertitude than by any definite fear or definite hope. The lowering daylight died out quickly, leaving him faced by a broken bridge. He descended into the ravine, forded a narrow stream by the last gleam of rapid water, and clambering out on the other side was met by the night, which fell like a bandage over his eyes. The wind, sweeping in the darkness, the broadside of the Sierra worried his ears by a continuous roaring noise, as of a maddened sea. He suspected that he had lost the road. Even in daylight, with its ruts and mud holes and ledges of outcropping stone, it was difficult to distinguish from the dreary waste of the moor, interspersed with boulders and clumps of naked bushes. But, as he says, he steered his course by the feel of the wind. His hat rammed low on his brow, his head down, stopping now and again from mere weariness of mind rather than of body, as if not his strength, but his resolution were being overtaxed by the strain of endeavour half suspected to be vain, and by the unrest of his feelings. In one of these pauses, borne in the wind faintly, as if from very far away, he heard a sound of knocking, just knocking on wood. He noticed that the wind had lulled suddenly. His heart started beating tumultuously, because in himself he carried the impression of the desert solitudes he had been traversing for the last 6 hours. the oppressive sense of an uninhabited world. When he raised his head, a gleam of light, illusory as it often happens in dense darkness, swam before his eyes. While he peered, the sound of feeble knocking was repeated, and suddenly he felt rather than saw the existence of a massive obstacle in his path. What was it? The spur of a hill? Or was it a house? Yes, it was a house right close, as though it had risen from the ground or had come gliding to meet him, dumb and pallid, from some dark recess of the night. It towered loftily. He had come up under its lee, another 3 steps, and he could have touched the wall with his hand. It was no doubt a posada, and some other traveller was trying for admittance. He heard again the sound of cautious knocking. Next moment, a broad band of light fell into the night through the open door. Burns stepped eagerly into it, whereupon the person outside leaped with a stifled cry away into the night. An exclamation of surprise was heard, too, from within. Byrne, flinging himself against the half-closed door, forced his way in against some considerable resistance. A miserable candle, a mere rushlight, burned at the end of a long deal table. And in its light, Byrne saw, staggering yet, the girl he had driven from the door. She had a short black skirt, an orange shawl, a dark complexion, and the escaped single hairs from the mass, sombre and thick like a forest, and held up by a comb, made a black mist about her low forehead. A shrill, lamentable howl of "Misericordia" came in 2 voices from the further end of the long room, where the firelight of an open hearth played between heavy shadows. The girl, recovering herself, drew a hissing breath through her set teeth. It is unnecessary to report the long process of questions and answers by which he soothed the fears of 2 old women who sat on each side of the fire, on which stood a large earthenware pot. Byrne thought at once of 2 witches watching the brewing of some deadly potion. But all the same, when one of them, raising forward painfully her broken form, lifted the cover of the pot, the escaping steam had an appetizing smell. The other did not budge, but sat hunched up, her head trembling all the time. They were horrible. There was something grotesque in their decrepitude, their toothless mouths, their hooked noses, the meagerness of the active one, and the hanging yellow cheeks of the other, the still one whose head trembled, would have been laughable if the sight of their dreadful physical degradation had not been appalling to one's eyes, had not gripped one's heart with poignant amazement at the unspeakable misery of age, at the awful persistency of life becoming at last an object of disgust and dread. To get over it, Byrne began to talk, saying that he was an Englishman and that he was in search of a countryman who ought to have passed this way. Directly he had spoken, the recollection of his parting with Tom came up in his mind with amazing vividness. The silent villagers, the angry gnome, the one-eyed wine-seller, Bernardino. Why, these 2 unspeakable frights must be that man's aunts, affiliated to the devil. Whatever they had been, once it was impossible to imagine what use such feeble creatures could be to the devil now in the world of the living. Which was Lucilla, and which was Erminia? They were now things without a name. A moment of suspended animation followed Byrne's words. The sorceress with the spoon ceased stirring the mess in the iron pot. The very trembling of the other's head stopped for the space of breath. In this infinitesimal fraction of a second, Byrne had the sense of being really on his quest, of having reached the turn of the path, almost within hail of Tom. They have seen him, he thought with conviction. Here was at last somebody who had seen him. He made sure they would deny all knowledge of the Ingalls, but on the contrary, they were eager to tell him that he had eaten and slept the night in the house. They both started talking together, describing his appearance and behavior. An excitement quite fierce in its feebleness possessed them. The doubled-up sorceress flourished aloft her wooden spoon. The puffy monster got off her stool and screeched, stepping from one foot to the other, while the trembling of her head was accelerated to positive vibration. Byrne was quite disconcerted by their excited behavior. Yes! The big, fierce Ingalls went away in the morning, after eating a piece of bread and drinking some wine. and if the caballero wished to follow the same path, nothing could be easier in the morning. "You will give me somebody to show me the way," said Byrne. "Sai, senor, a proper youth, the man the caballero saw going out." "But he was knocking at the door," protested Byrne. "He only bolted when he saw me. He was coming in." "No, no!" the two horrid witches screamed out together. "Going out! Going out!" After all, it may have been true. The sound of knocking had been faint, elusive, reflected Byrne. Perhaps only the effect of his fancy. He asked, "Who is that man?" "Her novio," they screamed, pointing to the girl. "He has gone home to a village far away from here, but he will return in the morning. Her novio, and she is an orphan, the child of poor Christian people. She lives with us for the love of God, for the love of God." The orphan, crouching on the corner of the hearth, had been looking at Byrne. He thought that she was more like a child of Satan kept there by these two weird harridans for the love of the devil. Her eyes were a little oblique, her mouth rather thick, but admirably formed. Her dark face had a wild beauty, voluptuous and untamed. As to the character of her steadfast gaze attached upon him with a sensuously savage attention. "To know what it was like," says Mr. Byrne, "you have only to observe a hungry cat watching a bird in a cage or a mouse inside a trap. It was she who served him the food, of which he was glad, though with those big, slanting black eyes examining him at close range, as if he had something curious written on his face, she gave him an uncomfortable sensation. But anything was better than being approached by these blear-eyed, nightmarish witches. His apprehensions somehow had been soothed, perhaps by the sensation of warmth after severe exposure and the ease of resting after the exertion of fighting the gale inch by inch all the way. He had no doubt of Tom's safety. He was now sleeping in the mountain camp, having been met by Gonzales's men. Byrne rose, filled a tin goblet with wine out of a skin hanging on the wall, and sat down again. The witch with the mummy face began to talk to him, ramblingly of old times. She boasted of the inn's fame in those better days. Great people in their own coaches stopped there. An archbishop slept once in the casa, a long, long time ago. The witch with the puffy face seemed to be listening from her stool, motionless, except for the trembling of her head. The girl, Byrne was certain she was a casual gypsy admitted there for some reason or other, sat on the hearthstone in the glow of the embers. She hummed a tune to herself, rattling a pair of castanets slightly now and then. At the mention of the archbishop, she chuckled impiously and turned her head to look at Byrne, so that the red glow of the fire flashed in her black eyes and on her white teeth under the dark cowl of the enormous overmantle. And he smiled at her. He rested now in the ease of security. His advent not having been expected, there could be no plot against him in existence. Drowsiness stole upon his senses. He enjoyed it, but keeping a hold, so he thought at least, on his wits. But he must have been gone further than he thought, because he was startled beyond measure by a fiendish uproar. He had never heard anything so pitilessly strident in his life. The witches had started a fierce quarrel about something or other. Whatever its origin, they were now only abusing each other violently, without arguments. Their senile screams expressed nothing but wicked anger and ferocious dismay. The gypsy girl's black eyes flew from one to the other. Never before had Byrne felt himself so removed from fellowship with human beings. Before he had really time to understand the subject of the quarrel, the girl jumped up, rattling her castanets loudly. A silence fell. She came up to the table and, bending over, her eyes in his. "Signor," she said with decision, "you shall sleep in the archbishop's room." Neither of the witches objected. The dried-up one, bent double, was propped on a stick. The puffy-faced one had now a crutch. Byrne got up, walked to the door, and turning the key in the enormous lock, put it coolly in his pocket. This was clearly the only entrance, and he did not mean to be taken unawares by whatever danger there might have been lurking outside. When he turned from the door, he saw the two witches, affiliated to the devil, and the satanic girl looking at him in silence. He wondered if Tom Corbin took the same precaution last night. And thinking of him, he had again that queer impression of his nearness. The world was perfectly dumb. And in this stillness, he heard the blood beating in his ears with a confused rushing noise in which there seemed to be a voice uttering the words, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir." Tom's voice. He shuddered, for the delusions of the senses of hearing are the most vivid of all, and from their nature have a compelling character. It seemed impossible that Tom should not be there. Again, a slight chill as of stealthy draught penetrated through his very clothes and passed over all his body. He shook off the impression with an effort. It was the girl who preceded him upstairs, carrying an iron lamp from the naked flame of which ascended a thin thread of smoke. Her soiled white stockings were full of holes. With the same quiet resolution with which he had locked the door below, Byrne threw open one after another the doors in the corridor. All the rooms were empty, except for some nondescript lumber in one or two, and the girl, seeing what he would be at, stopped every time, raising the smoky light in each doorway patiently. Meantime, she observed him with sustained attention. The last door of all she threw open herself. "You sleep here, senor," she murmured in a voice light like a child's breath, offering him the lamp. "Buenos noches, señorita," he said politely, taking it from her. She didn't return the wish audibly, though her lips did move a little, while her gaze, black like a starless night, never for a moment wavered before him. He stepped in, and as he turned to close the door, she was still there, motionless and disturbing, with her voluptuous mouth and slanting eyes, with the expression of expectant sensual ferocity of a baffled cat. He hesitated for a moment, and in the dumb house he heard again the blood pulsating ponderously in his ears, while once more the illusion of Tom's voice speaking earnestly somewhere nearby was specially terrifying, because this time he could not make out the words. He slammed the door in the girl's face at last, leaving her in the dark, and he opened it again almost on the instant. Nobody. She had vanished without the slightest sound. He closed the door quickly and bolted it with two heavy bolts. A profound mistrust possessed him suddenly. Why did the witches quarrel about letting him sleep here? And what meant that stare of the girl, as if she wanted to impress his features forever in her mind? His own nervousness alarmed him. He seemed to himself to be removed very far from mankind. He examined his room. It was not very high, just high enough to take the bed which stood under an enormous baldaquin-like canopy from which fell heavy curtains at foot and head, a bed certainly worthy of an archbishop. There was a heavy table carved all round the edges, some armchairs of enormous weight like the spoils of a grandee's palace, a tall, shallow wardrobe placed against the wall and with double doors. He tried them. Locked. A suspicion came into his mind, and he snatched the lamp to make a closer examination. No, it was not a disguised entrance. That heavy, tall piece of furniture stood clear of the wall by quite an inch. He glanced at the bolts of his room door. No, no one could get at him treacherously while he slept. But would he be able to sleep? He asked himself anxiously. If only he had Tom there, the trusty seaman who had fought at his right hand in a cutting-out affair or two, and had always preached to him the necessity to take care of himself. For it's no great trick, he used to say, to get yourself killed in a hot fight. Any fool can do that. The proper pastime is to fight the Frenchies and then live to fight another day. Byrne found it a hard matter not to fall into listening to the silence. Somehow he had the conviction that nothing would break it unless he heard again the haunting sound of Tom's voice. He had heard it twice before. Odd. And yet no wonder, he argued with himself reasonably, since he had been thinking of the man for over 30 hours continuously, and what's more, inconclusively. For his anxiety for Tom had never taken a definite shape. Disappear was the only word connected with the idea of Tom's danger. It was very vague and awful. Disappear! What did that mean? Byrne shuddered, and then said to himself that he must be a little feverish. But Tom had not disappeared. Byrne had just heard of him. And again the young man felt the blood beating in his ears. He sat still, expecting every moment to hear through the pulsating strokes the sound of Tom's voice. He waited, straining his ears, but nothing came. Suddenly the thought occurred to him. He has not disappeared, but he cannot make himself heard. He jumped up from the armchair. How absurd! Laying his pistol and his hanger on the table, he took off his boots and, feeling suddenly too tired to stand, flung himself on the bed, which he found soft and comfortable beyond his hopes. He had felt very wakeful, but he must have dozed off after all, because the next thing he knew he was sitting up in bed and trying to recollect what it was that Tom's voice had said. Oh, he remembered it now. It had said, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir." A warning, this. But against what? He landed with one leap in the middle of the floor, gasped once, then looked all round the room. The window was shuttered and barred with an iron bar. Again he ran his eyes slowly all round the bare walls, and even looked up at the ceiling, which was rather high. Afterwards he went to the door to examine the fastenings. They consisted of two enormous iron bolts sliding into holes made in the wall, and as the corridor outside was too narrow to admit of any battering arrangement or even to permit an axe to be swung, nothing could burst the door open, unless gunpowder. But while he was still making sure that the lower bolt was pushed well home, he received the impression of somebody's presence in the room. It was so strong that he spun round quicker than lightning. There was no one. Who could there be? And yet, it was then that he lost the decorum and restraint a man keeps up for his own sake. He got down on his hands and knees with the lamp on the floor to look under the bed, like a silly girl. He saw a lot of dust and nothing else. He got up, his cheeks burning, and walked about discontented with his own behaviour and unreasonably angry with Tom for not leaving him alone. The words, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir," kept on repeating themselves in his head in a tone of warning. Hadn't I better just throw myself on the bed and try to go to sleep? He asked himself. But his eyes fell on the tall wardrobe, and he went towards it, feeling irritated with himself, and yet unable to desist. How he could explain tomorrow the burglarious misdeed to the two odious witches he had no idea. Nevertheless, he inserted the point of his hanger between the two halves of the door and tried to prise them open. They resisted. He swore, sticking now hotly to his purpose. His mutter, "I hope you will be satisfied. Confound you," was addressed to the absent Tom. Just then the doors gave way and flew open. He was there. He, the trusty, sagacious, and courageous Tom, was there, drawn up shadowy and stiff, in a prudent silence, which his wide-open eyes, by their fixed gleam, seemed to command Byrne to respect. But Byrne was too startled to make a sound. Amazed, he stepped back a little, and on the instant the seaman flung himself forward headlong as if to clasp his officer round the neck. Instinctively, Byrne put out his faltering arms. He felt the horrible rigidity of the body, and then the coldness of death as their heads knocked together and their faces came into contact. They reeled, Byrne hugging Tom close to his breast in order not to let him fall with a crash. He had just strength enough to lower the awful burden gently to the floor. Then his head swam, his legs gave way, and he sank on his knees, leaning over the body with his hands resting on the breast of that man, once full of generous life, and now as insensible as a stone. "Dead! My poor Tom, dead!" he repeated mentally. The light of the lamp standing near the edge of the table fell from above straight on the stony, empty stare of these eyes, which naturally had a mobile and merry expression. Byrne turned his own away from them. Tom's black silk neckerchief was not knotted on his breast. It was gone. The murderers had also taken off his shoes and stockings, and noticing this spoliation, the exposed throat, the bare upturned feet, Byrne felt his eyes run full of tears. In other respects, the seaman was fully dressed. Neither was his clothing disarranged, as it must have been in a violent struggle. Only his checked shirt had been pulled a little out the waistband in one place, just enough to ascertain whether he had a money belt fastened round his body. Byrne began to sob into his handkerchief. It was a nervous outburst which passed off quickly. Remaining on his knees, he contemplated sadly the athletic body of as fine a seaman as ever had drawn a cutlass, laid a gun, or passed the weather earring in a gale, lying stiff and cold, his cheery, fearless spirit departed, perhaps turning to him, his boy-chum, to his ship out there rolling on the grey seas off an iron-bound coast at the very moment of its flight. He perceived that the 6 brass buttons of Tom's jacket had been cut off. He shuddered at the notion of the 2 miserable and repulsive witches busying themselves ghoulishly about the defenceless body of his friend. Cut off, perhaps with the same knife which... The head of one trembled. The other was bent double, and their eyes were red and bleared, their infamous claws unsteady. It must have been in this very room, too, for Tom could not have been killed in the open and brought in here afterwards. Of that, Byrne was certain. Yet those devilish crones could not have killed him themselves even by taking him unawares, and Tom would be always on his guard, of course. Tom was a very wide-awake, wary man when engaged on any service, and in fact, how did they murder him? Who did? In what way? Byrne jumped up, snatched the lamp off the table, and stooped swiftly over the body. The light revealed on the clothing no stain, no trace, no spot of blood anywhere. Byrne's hands began to shake so that he had to set the lamp on the floor and turn away his head in order to recover from this agitation. Then he began to explore that cold, still, and rigid body for a stab, a gunshot wound, for the trace of some killing blow. He felt all over the skull anxiously. It was whole. He slipped his hand under the neck. It was unbroken. With terrified eyes, he peered close under the chin and saw no marks of strangulation on the throat. There were no signs anywhere. He was just dead. Impulsively, Byrne got away from the body, as if the mystery of an incomprehensible death had changed his pity into suspicion and dread. The lamp on the floor near the set, still face of the seaman, showed it staring at the ceiling as if despairingly. In the circle of light, Byrne saw by the undisturbed patches of thick dust on the floor that there had been no struggle in that room. He has died outside, he thought. Yes, outside in that narrow corridor, where there was hardly room to turn, the mysterious death had come to his poor dear Tom. The impulse of snatching up his pistols and rushing out of the room abandoned Byrne suddenly. For Tom, too, had been armed, with just such powerless weapons as he himself possessed, pistols, a cutlass, and Tom had died a nameless death by incomprehensible means. A new thought came to Byrne. That stranger knocking at the door and fleeing so swiftly at his appearance had come there to remove the body. Aha! That was the guide the withered witch had promised would show the English officer the shortest way of rejoining his man. A promise, he saw it now, of dreadful import. He who had knocked would have 2 bodies to deal with. Man and officer would go forth from the house together, for Byrne was certain now that he would have to die before the morning, and in the same mysterious manner, leaving behind him an unmarked body. The sight of a smashed head, of a throat cut, of a gaping gunshot wound would have been an inexpressible relief. It would have soothed all his fears. His soul cried within him to that dead man whom he had never found wanting in danger. "Why don't you tell me what I am to look for, Tom? Why don't you?" But in rigid immobility, extended on his back, he seemed to preserve an austere silence, as if disdaining in the finality of his awful knowledge to hold converse with the living. Suddenly, Byrne flung himself on his knees by the side of the body, and dry-eyed, fierce, opened the shirt wide on the breast, as if to tear the secret forcibly from that cold heart which had been so loyal to him in life. Nothing, nothing. He raised the lamp, and all the sign vouchsafed to him by that face which used to be so kindly in expression was a small bruise on the forehead, the least thing, a mere mark. The skin, even, was not broken. He stared at it a long time as if lost in a dreadful dream. Then he observed that Tom's hands were clenched, as though he had fallen facing somebody in a fight with fists. His knuckles, on closer view, appeared somewhat abraded. Both hands. The discovery of these slight signs was more appalling to Byrne than the absolute absence of every mark would have been. So Tom had died striking against something which could be hit, and yet could kill one without leaving a wound, by a breath. Terror, hot terror, began to play about Byrne's heart like a tongue of flame that touches and withdraws before it turns a thing to ashes. He backed away from the body as far as he could, then came forward stealthily, casting fearful glances to steal another look at the bruised forehead. There would perhaps be such a faint bruise on his own forehead before the morning. "I can't bear it," he whispered to himself. Tom was for him now an object of horror, a sight at once tempting and revolting to his fear. He couldn't bear to look at him. At last, desperation getting the better of his increasing horror, he stepped forward from the wall against which he had been leaning, seized the corpse under the armpits, and began to lug it over to the bed. The bare heels of the seaman trailed on the floor noiselessly. He was heavy with the dead weight of inanimate objects. With a last effort, Byrne landed him face downwards on the edge of the bed, rolled him over, snatched from under this stiff, passive thing a sheet with which he covered it over. Then he spread the curtains at head and foot, so that, joining together as he shook their folds, they hid the bed altogether from his sight. He stumbled towards a chair and fell on it. The perspiration poured from his face for a moment, and then his veins seemed to carry for a while a thin stream of half-frozen blood. Complete terror had possession of him now, a nameless terror which had turned his heart to ashes. He sat upright in the straight-backed chair, the lamp burning at his feet, his pistols and his hanger at his left elbow on the end of the table, his eyes turning incessantly in their sockets round the walls, over the ceiling, over the floor, in the expectation of a mysterious and appalling vision. The thing which could deal death in a breath was outside that bolted door. But Byrne believed neither in walls nor bolts now. Unreasoning terror turning everything to account, his old-time boyish admiration of the athletic Tom, the undaunted Tom, he had seemed to him invincible, helped to paralyze his faculties, added to his despair. He was no longer Edgar Byrne. He was a tortured soul suffering more anguish than any sinner's body had ever suffered from rack or boot. The depth of his torment may be measured when I say that this young man, as brave at least as the average of his kind, contemplated seizing a pistol and firing into his own head, but a deadly, chilly languor was spreading over his limbs. It was as if his flesh had been wet plaster, stiffening slowly about his ribs. Presently, he thought, the two witches will be coming in, with crutch and stick, horrible, grotesque, monstrous, affiliated to the devil, to put a mark on his forehead, the tiny little bruise of death. And he wouldn't be able to do anything. Tom had struck out at something, but he was not like Tom. His limbs were dead already. He sat still, dying the death over and over again, and the only part of him which moved were his eyes, turning round and round in their sockets, running over the walls, the floor, the ceiling, again and again, till suddenly they became motionless and stony, starting out of his head, fixed in the direction of the bed. He had seen the heavy curtains stir and shake, as if the dead body they concealed had turned over and sat up. Byrne, who thought the world could hold no more terrors in store, felt his hair stir at the roots. He gripped the arms of the chair, his jaw fell, and the sweat broke out on his brow, while his dry tongue clove suddenly to the roof of his mouth. Again the curtain stirred, but did not open. "Don't, Tom!" Byrne made effort to shout, but all he heard was a slight moan, such as an uneasy sleeper may make. He felt that his brain was going, for now it seemed to him that the ceiling over the bed had moved, had slanted, and came level again, and once more the closed curtains swayed gently as if about to part. Byrne closed his eyes, not to see the awful apparition of the seaman's corpse coming out animated by an evil spirit. In the profound silence of the room, he endured a moment of frightful agony, then opened his eyes again, and he saw at once that the curtains remained closed still, but that the ceiling over the bed had risen quite a foot. With the last gleam of reason left to him, he understood that it was the enormous baldaquin over the bed which was coming down, while the curtains attached to it swayed softly, sinking gradually to the floor. His drooping jaw snapped to, and half rising in his chair, he watched mutely the noiseless descent of the monstrous canopy. It came down in short, smooth rushes till lowered halfway or more, when it took a run and settled swiftly its turtle-back shape, with the deep border piece fitting exactly the edge of the bedstead. A slight crack or two of wood were heard, and the overpowering stillness of the room resumed its sway. Burns stood up, gasped for breath, and let out a cry of rage and dismay, the first sound which he is perfectly certain did make its way past his lips on this night of terrors. This, then, was the death he had escaped. This was the devilish artifice of murder poor Tom's soul had perhaps tried from beyond the border to warn him of, for this was how he had died. Byrne was certain he had heard the voice of the seaman, faintly distinct in his familiar phrase, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir," and again uttering words he could not make out. But then the distance separating the living from the dead is so great. Poor Tom had tried. Byrne ran to the bed and attempted to lift up, to push off the horrible lid smothering the body. It resisted his efforts, heavy as lead, immovable like a tombstone. The rage of vengeance made him desist. His head buzzed with chaotic thoughts of extermination. He turned round the room as if he could find neither his weapons nor the way out, and all the time he stammered awful menaces. A violent battering at the door of the inn recalled him to his soberer senses. He flew to the window, pulled the shutters open, and looked out. In the faint dawn, he saw below him a mob of men. Ha! He would go and face at once this murderous lot, collected no doubt for his undoing. After his struggle with nameless terrors, he yearned for an open fray with armed enemies. But he must have remained yet bereft of his reason, because forgetting his weapons, he rushed downstairs with a wild cry, unbarred the door while blows were raining on it outside, and flinging it open, flew with his bare hands at the throat of the first man he saw before him. They rolled over together. Byrne's hazy intention was to break through, to fly up the mountain path, and come back presently with Gonzales's men to exact an exemplary vengeance. He fought furiously, till a tree, a house, a mountain seemed to crash down upon his head, and he knew no more. Here Mr. Byrne describes in detail the skilful manner in which he found his broken head bandaged, informs us that he had lost a great deal of blood, and ascribes the preservation of his sanity to that circumstance. He sets down Gonzales' profuse apologies in full, too, for it was Gonzales who, tired of waiting for news from the English, had come down to the inn with half his band on his way to the sea. His Excellency, he explained, rushed out with fierce impetuosity, and moreover was not known to us for a friend, and so we, etc., etc. When asked what had become of the witches, he only pointed his finger silently to the ground, then voiced calmly a moral reflection. "The passion for gold is pitiless in the very old, Seigneur," he said. "No doubt in former days they have put many a solitary traveller to sleep in the archbishop's bed." "There was also a gypsy girl there," said Byrne feebly from the improvised litter on which he was being carried to the coast by a squad of guerrilleros. "It was she who winched up that infernal machine, and it was she too who lowered it that night," was the answer. "But why? Why?" exclaimed Byrne. "Why should she wish for my death?" "No doubt for the sake of your Excellency's coat buttons," said politely the saturnine Gonzales. "We found those of the dead mariner concealed on her person, but your Excellency may rest assured that everything that is fitting has been done on this occasion." Byrne asked no more questions. There was still another death which was considered by Gonzales as fitting to the occasion. The one-eyed Bernardino stuck against the wall of his wine shop received the charge of 6 escopetas into his breast. As the shots rang out, the rough bier with Tom's body on it went past, carried by a bandit-like gang of Spanish patriots, down the ravine to the shore, where 2 boats from the ship were waiting for what was left on earth of her best seamen. Mr. Byrne, very pale and weak, stepped into the boat which carried the body of his humble friend, for it was decided that Tom Corbin should rest far out in the Bay of Biscay. The officer took the tiller and, turning his head for the last look at the shore, saw on the grey hillside something moving, which he made out to be a little man in a yellow hat mounted on a mule, that mule without which the fate of Tom Corbin would have remained mysterious forever. The Informer, an ironic tale by Joseph Conrad. Mr. X came to me, preceded by a letter of introduction from a good friend of mine in Paris, specifically to see my collection of Chinese bronzes and porcelain. My friend in Paris is a collector too. He collects neither porcelain, nor bronzes, nor pictures, nor medals, nor stamps, nor anything that could be profitably dispersed under an auctioneer's hammer. He would reject, with genuine surprise, the name of a collector. Nevertheless, that's what he is by temperament. He collects acquaintances. It is delicate work. He brings to it the patience, the passion, the determination of a true collector of curiosities. His collection does not contain any royal personages. I don't think he considers them sufficiently rare and interesting, but, with that exception, he has met with and talked to everyone worth knowing on any conceivable ground. He observes them, listens to them, penetrates them, measures them, and puts the memory away in the galleries of his mind. He has schemed, plotted, and travelled all over Europe in order to add to his collection of distinguished personal acquaintances. As he is wealthy, well-connected, and unprejudiced, his collection is pretty complete, including objects, or should I say subjects, whose value is unappreciated by the vulgar and often unknown to popular fame, of Trevolt of modern times. The world knows him as a revolutionary writer whose savage irony has laid bare the rottenness of the most respectable institutions. He has scalped every venerated head and has mangled at the stake of his wit every received opinion and every recognized principle of conduct and policy. Who does not remember his flaming red revolutionary pamphlets? Their sudden swarmings used to overwhelm the powers of every continental police like a plague of crimson gadflies. But this extreme writer has been also the active inspirer of secret societies, the mysterious unknown number 1 of desperate conspiracies suspected and unsuspected, matured or baffled. And the world at large has never had an inkling of that fact. This accounts for him going about amongst us to this day, a veteran of many subterranean campaigns, standing aside now, safe within his reputation of merely the greatest destructive publicist that ever lived. Thus wrote my friend, adding that Mr. X was an enlightened connoisseur of bronzes and china, and asking me to show him my collection. X turned up in due course. My treasures are disposed in 3 large rooms without carpets and curtains. There is no other furniture than the etagres and the glass cases whose contents shall be worth a fortune to my heirs. I allow no fires to be lighted for fear of accidents, and a fireproof door separates them from the rest of the house. It was a bitter, cold day. We kept on our overcoats and hats. Middle-sized and spare, his eyes alert in a long, Roman-nosed countenance, X walked on his neat little feet with short steps and looked at my collection intelligently. I hope I looked at him intelligently too. A snow-white moustache and imperial made his nut-brown complexion appear darker than it really was. In his fur coat and shiny tall hat, that terrible man looked fashionable. I believe he belonged to a noble family and could have called himself Vicomte X de la Zede if he chose. We talked nothing but bronzes and porcelain. He was remarkably appreciative. We parted on cordial terms. Where he was staying, I don't know. I imagine he must have been a lonely man. Anarchists, I suppose, have no families. Not, at any rate, as we understand that social relation. Organization into families may answer to a need of human nature, but in the last instance, it is based on law, and therefore must be something odious and impossible to an anarchist. But indeed, I don't understand anarchists. Does a man of that persuasion still remain an anarchist when alone, quite alone and going to bed, for instance? Does he lay his head on the pillow, pull his bedclothes over him, and go to sleep with the necessity of the chambardement general, as the French slang has it, of the general blow-up, always present to his mind? And if so, how can he? I am sure that if such a faith or such a fanaticism once mastered my thoughts, I would never be able to compose myself sufficiently to sleep or eat or perform any of the routine acts of daily life. I would want no wife, no children. I could have no friends, it seems to me. And as to collecting bronzes or china, that, I should say, would be quite out of the question. But I don't know. All I know is that Mr. X took his meals in a very good restaurant, which I frequented also. With his head uncovered, the silver top-knot of his brushed-up hair completed the character of his physiognomy, all bony ridges and sunken hollows, clothed in a perfect impassiveness of expression. His meagre brown hands, emerging from large white cuffs, came and went breaking bread, pouring wine, and so on, with quiet, mechanical precision. His head and body above the tablecloth had a rigid immobility. This firebrand, this great agitator, exhibited the least possible amount of warmth and animation. His voice was rasping, cold and monotonous in a low key. He could not be called a talkative personality, but with his detached, calm manner, he appeared as ready to keep the conversation going as to drop it at any moment. And his conversation was by no means commonplace. To me, I own, there was some excitement in talking quietly across a dinner table with a man whose venomous pen stabs had sapped the vitality of at least one monarchy. That much was a matter of public knowledge. But I knew more. I knew of him, from my friend, as a certainty what the guardians of social order in Europe had at most only suspected or dimly guessed at. He had had what I may call his underground life. And as I sat, evening after evening, facing him at dinner, a curiosity in that direction would naturally arise in my mind. I am a quiet and peaceable product of civilization, and know no passion other than the passion for collecting things which are rare, and must remain exquisite, even if approaching to the monstrous. Some Chinese bronzes are monstrously precious. And here, out of my friend's collection, here I had before me a kind of rare monster. It is true that this monster was polished and, in a sense, even exquisite. His beautiful, unruffled manner was that. But then he was not of bronze. He was not even Chinese, which would have enabled one to contemplate him calmly across the gulf of racial difference. He was alive and European. He had the manner of good society, wore a coat and hat like mine, and had pretty near the same taste in cooking. It was too frightful to think of. One evening he remarked, casually, in the course of conversation, "There's no amendment to be got out of mankind except by terror and violence." You can imagine the effect of such a phrase out of such a man's mouth upon a person like myself, whose whole scheme of life had been based upon a suave and delicate discrimination of social and artistic values. Just imagine! Upon me, to whom all sorts and forms of violence appeared as unreal as the giants, ogres, and seven-headed hydras whose activities affect, fantastically, the course of legends and fairy tales. I seemed suddenly to hear above the festive bustle and clatter of the brilliant restaurant the mutter of a hungry and seditious multitude. I suppose I'm impressionable and imaginative. I had a disturbing vision of darkness, full of lean jaws and wild eyes, amongst the 100 electric lights of the place. But somehow this vision made me angry, too. The sight of that man, so calm, breaking bits of white bread, exasperated me, and I had the audacity to ask him how it was that the starving proletariat of Europe, to whom he had been preaching revolt and violence, had not been made indignant by his openly luxurious life. "At all this," I said pointedly, with a glance round the room and at the bottle of champagne we generally shared between us at dinner. He remained unmoved. "Do I feed on their toil and their heart's blood? Am I a speculator or a capitalist? Did I steal my fortune from a starving people? No. They know this very well, and they envy me nothing. The miserable mass of the people is generous to its leaders. What I have acquired has come to me through my writings, not from the millions of pamphlets distributed gratis to the hungry and the oppressed, but from the hundreds of thousands of copies sold to the well-fed bourgeoisie. You know that my writings were at one time the rage, the fashion, the thing to read with wonder and horror, to turn your eyes up at my pathos, or else to laugh in ecstasies at my wit. Yes, I admitted. I remember, of course, and I confess frankly that I could never understand that infatuation. "Don't you know yet," he said, "that an idle and selfish class loves to see mischief being made, even if it is made at its own expense? Its own life being all a matter of pose and gesture, it is unable to realize the power and the danger of a real movement and of words that have no sham meaning. It is all fun and sentiment. It is sufficient, for instance, to point out the attitude of the old French aristocracy towards the philosophers whose words were preparing the great revolution. Even in England, where you have some common sense, a demagogue has only to shout loud enough and long enough to find some backing in the very class he is shouting at. You, too, like to see mischief being made. The demagogue carries the amateurs of emotion with him. Amateurism in this, that, and the other thing is a delightfully easy way of killing time and feeding one's own vanity, the silly vanity of being abreast with the ideas of the day after tomorrow. Just as good and otherwise harmless people will join you in ecstasies over your collection without having the slightest notion in what its marvelousness really consists. I hung my head. It was a crushing illustration of the sad truth he advanced. The world is full of such people, and that instance of the French aristocracy before the Revolution was extremely telling too. I could not traverse his statement, though its cynicism, always a distasteful trait, took off much of its value to my mind. However, I admit I was impressed. I felt the need to say something which would not be in the nature of assent, and yet would not invite discussion. "You don't mean to say," I observed airily, "that extreme revolutionists have ever been actively assisted by the infatuation of such people?" I did not mean exactly that by what I said just now. I generalized. But since you ask me, I may tell you that such help has been given to revolutionary activities, more or less consciously, in various countries, and even in this country. "Impossible," I protested with firmness. "We don't play with fire to that extent. And yet you can better afford it than others, perhaps. But let me observe that most women, if not always ready to play with fire, are generally eager to play with a loose spark or so." "Is this a joke?" I asked, smiling. "If it is, I am not aware of it," he said woodenly. I was thinking of an instance. "Oh, mild enough in a way." I became all expectation at this. I had tried many times to approach him on his underground side, so to speak. The very word had been pronounced between us, but he had always met me with his impenetrable calm. "And at the same time," Mr. X continued, "it will give you a notion of the difficulties that may arise in what you are pleased to call underground work. It is sometimes difficult to deal with them. Of course, there is no hierarchy amongst the affiliated, no rigid system." My surprise was great, but short-lived. Clearly, amongst extreme anarchists, there could be no hierarchy, nothing in the nature of a law of precedence. The idea of anarchy ruling among anarchists was comforting, too. It could not possibly make for efficiency. Mr. X startled me by asking, abruptly, "You know Herion Street?" I nodded, doubtful assent. Hermione Street has been, within the last 3 years, improved out of any man's knowledge. The name exists still, but not one brick or stone of the old Hermione Street is left now. It was the old street he meant, for he said there was a row of two-storied brick houses on the left, with their backs against the wing of a great public building. You remember? Would it surprise you very much to hear that one of these houses was for a time the centre of anarchist propaganda and of what you would call underground action? Not at all, I declared. Hermione Street had never been particularly respectable, as I remembered it. The house was the property of a distinguished government official, he added, sipping his champagne. Oh, indeed, I said, this time not believing a word of it. Of course he was not living there, Mr. X continued. But from 10 till 4 he sat next door to it, the dear man, in his well-appointed private room in the wing of the public building I've mentioned. To be strictly accurate, I must explain that the house in Hermione Street did not really belong to him. It belonged to his grown-up children, a daughter and a son. The girl, a fine figure, was by no means vulgarly pretty. To more personal charm than mere youth could account for, she added the seductive appearance of enthusiasm, of independence, of courageous thought. I suppose she put on these appearances as she put on her picturesque dresses, and for the same reason, to assert her individuality at any cost. You know, women would go to any length almost for such a purpose. She went to a great length. She had acquired all the appropriate gestures of revolutionary convictions, the gestures of pity, of anger, of indignation against the anti-humanitarian vices of the social class to which she belonged herself. All this sat on her striking personality as well as her slightly original costumes. Very slightly original, just enough to mark a protest against the philistinism of the overfed taskmasters of the poor. Just enough, and no more. It would not have done to go too far in that direction. You understand. But she was of age, and nothing stood in the way of her offering her house to the revolutionary workers. "You don't mean it!" I cried. "I assure you," he affirmed, "that she made that very practical gesture. How else could they have got hold of it? The cause is not rich, and moreover, there would have been difficulties with any ordinary house agent who would have wanted references and so on. The group she came in contact with while exploring the poor quarters of the town, you know, the gesture of charity and personal service which was so fashionable some years ago, accepted with gratitude. The first advantage was that Hermione Street is, as you know, well away from the suspect part of the town, specially watched by the police. The ground floor consisted of a little Italian restaurant of the fly-blown sort. There was no difficulty in buying the proprietor out. A woman and a man belonging to the group took it on. The man had been a cook. The comrades could get their meals there, unnoticed amongst the other customers. This was another advantage. The first floor was occupied by a shabby variety artists agency, an agency for performers in inferior music halls, you know. A fellow called Bomb, I remember. He was not disturbed. It was rather favourable than otherwise to have a lot of foreign-looking people, jugglers, acrobats, singers of both sexes, and so on, going in and out all day long. The police paid no attention to new faces, you see. The top floor happened, most conveniently, to stand empty then. X interrupted himself to attack impassively, with measured movements, a bombe glacée, which the waiter had just set down on the table. He swallowed carefully a few spoonfuls of the iced sweet and asked me, "Did you ever hear of Stone's dried soup?" "Hear of what?" "It was," X pursued evenly, "a comestible article, once rather prominently advertised in the dailies, but which never, somehow, gained the favour of the public. The enterprise fizzled out, as you say here. Parcels of their stock could be picked up at auctions at considerably less than a penny a pound. The group bought some of it, and an agency for Stone's dried soup was started on the top floor, a perfectly respectable business. The stuff, a yellow powder of extremely unappetizing aspect, was put up in large square tins, of which 6 went to a case. If anybody ever came to give an order, it was, of course, executed. But the advantage of the powder was this, that things could be concealed in it very conveniently. Now and then, a special case got put on a van and sent off to be exported abroad under the very nose of the policeman on duty at the corner. You understand? I think I do, I said, with an expressive nod at the remnants of the bomb melting slowly in the dish. Exactly. But the cases were useful in another way, too. In the basement, or in the cellar at the back, rather, two printing presses were established. A lot of revolutionary literature of the most inflammatory kind was got away from the house in Stone's dried soup cases. The brother of our anarchist young lady found some occupation there. He wrote articles, helped to set up type and pull off the sheets, and generally assisted the man in charge, a very able young fellow called Severin. The guiding spirit of that group was a fanatic of social revolution. He is dead now. He was an engraver and etcher of genius. You must have seen his work. It is much sought after by certain amateurs now. He began by being revolutionary in his art, and ended by becoming a revolutionist after his wife and child had died in want and misery. He used to say that the bourgeoisie, the smug, overfed lot, had killed them. That was his real belief. He still worked at his art and led a double life. He was tall, gaunt, and swarthy, with a long, brown beard and deep-set eyes. You must have seen him. His name was Horn. At this, I was really startled. Of course, years ago I used to meet Horn about. He looked like a powerful, rough gypsy in an old top hat with a red muffler round his throat and buttoned up in a long, shabby overcoat. He talked of his art with exultation and gave one the impression of being strung up to the verge of insanity. A small group of connoisseurs appreciated his work. Who would have thought that this man? Amazing. And yet, it was not, after all, so difficult to believe. As you see, X went on, this group was in a position to pursue its work of propaganda, and the other kind of work too, under very advantageous conditions. They were all resolute, experienced men of a superior stamp, and yet we became struck at length by the fact that plans prepared in Herion Street almost invariably failed. Who were we? I asked pointedly. Some of us in Brussels, at the centre, he said hastily. Whatever vigorous action originated in Herion Street seemed doomed to failure. Something always happened to baffle the best planned manifestations in every part of Europe. It was a time of general activity. You must not imagine that all our failures are of a loud sort, with arrests and trials. That is not so. Often the police work quietly, almost secretly, defeating our combinations by clever counterplotting. No arrests, no noise, no alarming of the public mind and inflaming the passions. It is a wise procedure. But at that time, the police were too uniformly successful from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. It was annoying and began to look dangerous. At last, we came to the conclusion that there must be some untrustworthy elements amongst the London groups, and I came over to see what could be done quietly. My first step was to call upon our young lady amateur of anarchism at her private house. She received me in a flattering way. I judged that she knew nothing of the chemical and other operations going on at the top of the house in Herion Street. The printing of anarchist literature was the only activity she seemed to be aware of there. She was displaying very strikingly the usual signs of severe enthusiasm and had already written many sentimental articles with ferocious conclusions. I could see she was enjoying herself hugely with all the gestures and grimaces of deadly earnestness. They suited her big-eyed, broad-browed face and the good carriage of her shapely head, crowned by a magnificent lot of brown hair, done in an unusual and becoming style. Her brother was in the room, too, a serious youth, with arched eyebrows and wearing a red necktie, who struck me as being absolutely in the dark about everything in the world, including himself. By and by a tall young man came in. He was clean-shaved, with a strong bluish jaw and something of the air of a taciturn actor or of a fanatical priest, the type with thick black eyebrows, you know. But he was very presentable indeed. He shook hands at once vigorously with each of us. The young lady came up to me and murmured sweetly, "Comrade Severin." I had never seen him before. He had little to say to us, but sat down by the side of the girl and they fell at once into earnest conversation. She leaned forward in her deep armchair and took her nicely rounded chin in her beautiful white hand. He looked attentively into her eyes. It was the attitude of love-making, serious, intense, as if on the brink of the grave. I suppose she felt it necessary to round and complete her assumption of advanced ideas, of revolutionary lawlessness, by making believe to be in love with an anarchist. And this one, I repeat, was extremely presentable, notwithstanding his fanatical, black-browed aspect. After a few stolen glances in their direction, I had no doubt that he was in earnest. As to the lady, her gestures were unapproachable, better than the very thing itself in the blended suggestion of dignity, sweetness, condescension, fascination, surrender, and reserve. She interpreted her conception of what that precise sort of love-making should be with consummate art. And so far, she too, no doubt, was in earnest. Gestures, but so perfect. After I had been left alone with our lady amateur, I informed her guardedly of the object of my visit. I hinted at our suspicions. I wanted to hear what she would have to say, and half expected some perhaps unconscious revelation. All she said was, "That's serious," looking delightfully concerned and grave. But there was a sparkle in her eyes which meant plainly, "How exciting." After all, she knew little of anything except of words. Still, she undertook to put me in communication with Horn, who was not easy to find unless in Herion Street, where I did not wish to show myself just then. I met Horn. This was another kind of a fanatic altogether. I exposed to him the conclusion we in Brussels had arrived at, and pointed out the significant series of failures. To this he answered with irrelevant exultation. "I have something in hand that shall strike terror into the heart of these gorged brutes." And then I learned that, by excavating in one of the cellars of the house, he and some companions had made their way into the vaults under the great public building I have mentioned before. The blowing up of a whole wing was a certainty as soon as the materials were ready. I was not so appalled at the stupidity of that move as I might have been had not the usefulness of our centre in Herion Street become already very problematical. In fact, in my opinion, it was much more of a police trap by this time than anything else. What was necessary now was to discover what, or rather who, was wrong, and I managed at last to get that idea into Horn's head. He glared, perplexed, his nostrils working as if he were sniffing treachery in the air. And here comes a piece of work, which will no doubt strike you as a sort of theatrical expedient. And yet what else could have been done? The problem was to find out the untrustworthy member of the group, but no suspicion could be fastened on one more than another. To set a watch upon them all was not very practicable. Besides, that proceeding often fails. In any case, it takes time, and the danger was pressing. I felt certain that the premises in Herion Street would be ultimately raided, though the police had evidently such confidence in the informer that the house, for the time being, was not even watched. Horn was positive on that point. Under the circumstances, it was an unfavorable symptom. Something had to be done quickly. I decided to organize a raid myself upon the group. Do you understand? A raid of other trusty comrades personating the police. A conspiracy within a conspiracy. You see the object of it, of course. When apparently about to be arrested, I hoped the informer would betray himself in some way or other, either by some unguarded act or simply by his unconcerned demeanor, for instance. Of course, there was the risk of complete failure, and the no lesser risk of some fatal accident in the course of resistance, perhaps, or in the efforts at escape. For, as you will easily see, the Herion Street group had to be actually and completely taken unawares, as I was sure they would be by the real police before very long. The informer was amongst them, and Horn alone could be let into the secret of my plan. I will not enter into the detail of my preparations. It was not very easy to arrange, but it was done very well, with a really convincing effect. The sham police invaded the restaurant, whose shutters were immediately put up. The surprise was perfect. Most of the Herion Street party were found in the second cellar, enlarging the hole communicating with the vaults of the great public building. At the first alarm, several comrades bolted through impulsively into the aforesaid vault, where, of course, had this been a genuine raid, they would have been hopelessly trapped. We did not bother about them for the moment. They were harmless enough. The top floor caused considerable anxiety to Horn and myself. There, surrounded by tins of Stone's dried soup, a comrade, nicknamed the Professor, he was an ex-science student, was engaged in perfecting some new detonators. He was an abstracted, self-confident, sallow little man, armed with large round spectacles, and we were afraid that under a mistaken impression he would blow himself up and wreck the house about our ears. I rushed upstairs and found him already at the door, on the alert, listening, as he said, to suspicious noises down below. Before I had quite finished explaining to him what was going on, he shrugged his shoulders disdainfully and turned away to his balances and test tubes. His was the true spirit of an extreme revolutionist. Explosives were his faith, his hope, his weapon, and his shield. He perished a couple of years afterwards in a secret laboratory through the premature explosion of one of his improved detonators. Hurrying down again, I found an impressive scene in the gloom of the big cellar. The man who personated the inspector, he was no stranger to the part, was speaking harshly and giving bogus orders to his bogus subordinates for the removal of his prisoners. Evidently, nothing enlightening had happened so far. Horn, saturnine and swarthy, waited with folded arms, and his patient, moody expectation had an air of stoicism well in keeping with the situation. I detected in the shadows one of the Herion Street group surreptitiously chewing up and swallowing a small piece of paper. Some compromising scrap, I suppose, perhaps just a note of a few names and addresses. He was a true and faithful companion. But the fund of secret malice which lurks at the bottom of our sympathies caused me to feel amused at that perfectly uncalled-for performance. In every other respect, the risky experiment, the theatrical coup, if you like to call it so, seemed to have failed. The deception could not be kept up much longer. The explanation would bring about a very embarrassing and even grave situation. The man who had eaten the paper would be furious. The fellows who had bolted away would be angry too. To add to my vexation, the door communicating with the other cellar, where the printing presses were, flew open, and our young lady revolutionist appeared, a black silhouette in a close-fitting dress and a large hat, with the blaze of gas flaring in there at her back. Over her shoulder, I perceived the arched eyebrows and the red necktie of her brother. The last people in the world I wanted to see then. They had gone that evening to some amateur concert for the delectation of the poor people, you know, but she had insisted on leaving early on purpose to call in Herion Street on the way home, under the pretext of having some work to do. Her usual task was to correct the proofs of the Italian and French editions of the alarm bell and the firebrand. Heavens, I murmured. I had been shown once a few copies of these publications. Nothing, in my opinion, could have been less fit for the eyes of a young lady. They were the most advanced things of the sort. Advanced, I mean, beyond all bounds of reason and decency. One of them preached the dissolution of all social and domestic ties. The other advocated systematic murder. To think of a young girl calmly tracking printers' errors all along the sort of abominable sentences I remembered was intolerable to my sentiment of womanhood. Mr. X, after giving me a glance, pursued steadily. I think, however, that she came mostly to exercise her fascinations upon Severin and to receive his homage in her queenly and condescending way. She was aware of both her power and his homage, and enjoyed them with, I dare say, complete innocence. We have no ground in expediency or morals to quarrel with her on that account. Charm in woman and exceptional intelligence in man are a law unto themselves. Is it not so? I refrained from expressing my abhorrence of that licentious doctrine because of my curiosity. But what happened then? I hastened to ask. X went on crumbling slowly a small piece of bread with a careless left hand. What happened, in effect, he confessed, is that she saved the situation. She gave you an opportunity to end your rather sinister farce, I suggested. Yes, he said, preserving his impassive bearing. The farce was bound to end soon, and it ended in a very few minutes, and it ended well. Had she not come in, it might have ended badly. Her brother, of course, did not count. They had slipped into the house quietly some time before. The printing cellar had an entrance of its own. Not finding anyone there, she sat down to her proofs, expecting Severin to return to his work at any moment. He did not do so. She grew impatient, heard through the door the sounds of a disturbance in the other cellar, and naturally came in to see what was the matter. Severin had been with us. At first he had seemed to me the most amazed of the whole raided lot. He appeared for an instant as if paralyzed with astonishment. He stood rooted to the spot. He never moved a limb. A solitary gas jet flared near his head. All the other lights had been put out at the first alarm, and presently, from my dark corner, I observed on his shaven actor's face an expression of puzzled, vexed watchfulness. He knitted his heavy eyebrows. The corners of his mouth dropped scornfully. He was angry. Most likely he had seen through the game, and I regretted I had not taken him from the first into my complete confidence. But with the appearance of the girl he became obviously alarmed. It was plain. I could see it grow. The change of his expression was swift and startling, and I did not know why. The reason never occurred to me. I was merely astonished at the extreme alteration of the man's face. Of course he had not been aware of her presence in the other cellar, but that did not explain the shock her advent had given him. For a moment he seemed to have been reduced to imbecility. He opened his mouth as if to shout, or perhaps only to gasp. At any rate, it was somebody else who shouted. This somebody else was the heroic comrade whom I had detected swallowing a piece of paper. With laudable presence of mind, he let out a warning yell. "It's the police! Back! Back! Run back and bolt the door behind you!" It was an excellent hint, but instead of retreating, the girl continued to advance, followed by her long-faced brother in his knickerbocker suit, in which he had been singing comic songs for the entertainment of a joyless proletariat. She advanced not as if she had failed to understand — the word police has an unmistakable sound — but rather as if she could not help herself. She did not advance with the free gait and expanding presence of a distinguished amateur anarchist amongst poor, struggling professionals, but with slightly raised shoulders, and her elbows pressed close to her body, as if trying to shrink within herself. Her eyes were fixed immovably upon Severin. Severin the man, I fancy, not Severin the anarchist. But she advanced, and that was natural. For all their assumption of independence, girls of that class are used to the feeling of being specially protected, as in fact they are. This feeling accounts for 9/10 of their audacious gestures. Her face had gone completely colourless. Ghastly. Fancy having it brought home to her so brutally that she was the sort of person who must run away from the police. I believe she was pale with indignation, mostly, though there was, of course, also the concern for her intact personality, a vague dread of some sort of rudeness. And naturally she turned to the man on whom she had a claim of fascination and homage, the man who could not conceivably fail her at any juncture. But, I cried, amazed at this analysis, if it had been serious, real, I mean, as she thought it was, what could she expect him to do for her? X never moved a muscle of his face. Goodness knows. I imagine that this charming, generous, and independent creature had never known in her life a single genuine thought. I mean a single thought detached from small human vanities, or whose source was not in some conventional perception. All I know is that after advancing a few steps, she extended her hand towards the motionless Severin, and that at least was no gesture. It was a natural movement. As to what she expected him to do, who can tell? The impossible. But whatever she expected, it could not have come up, I am safe to say, to what he had made up his mind to do, even before that entreating hand had appealed to him so directly. It had not been necessary. From the moment he had seen her enter that cellar, he had made up his mind to sacrifice his future usefulness, to throw off the impenetrable, solidly fastened mask it had been his pride to wear. "What do you mean?" I interrupted, puzzled. "Was it Severin, then, who was—" "He was. The most persistent, the most dangerous, the craftiest, the most systematic of informers, a genius amongst betrayers. Fortunately for us, he was unique. The man was a fanatic, I've told you. Fortunately, again, for us, he had fallen in love with the accomplished and innocent gestures of that girl. An actor in desperate earnest himself, he must have believed in the absolute value of conventional signs. As to the grossness of the trap into which he fell, the explanation must be that two sentiments of such absorbing magnitude cannot exist simultaneously in one heart. The danger of that other and unconscious comedian robbed him of his vision, of his perspicacity, of his judgment. Indeed, it did at first rob him of his self-possession, but he regained that through the necessity, as it appeared to him imperiously, to do something at once. To do what? Why, to get her out of the house as quickly as possible. He was desperately anxious to do that. I've told you he was terrified. It could not be about himself. He had been surprised and annoyed at a move quite unforeseen and premature. I may even say he had been furious. He was accustomed to arrange the last scene of his betrayals with a deep, subtle art which left his revolutionist reputation untouched. But it seems clear to me that at the same time he had resolved to make the best of it, to keep his mask resolutely on. It was only with the discovery of her being in the house that everything, the forced calm, the restraint of his fanaticism, the mask, all came off together in a kind of panic. Why panic, do you ask? The answer is very simple. He remembered, or I dare say he had never forgotten, the professor alone at the top of the house, pursuing his researches, surrounded by tins upon tins of Stone's dried soup. There was enough in some few of them to bury us all where we stood under a heap of bricks. Severin, of course, was aware of that, and we must believe also that he knew the exact character of the man. He had gauged so many such characters, or perhaps he only gave the professor credit for what he himself was capable of. But in any case, the effect was produced, and suddenly he raised his voice in authority. "Get the lady away at once." It turned out that he was as hoarse as a crow, result, no doubt, of the intense emotion. It passed off in a moment, but these fateful words issued forth from his contracted throat in a discordant, ridiculous croak. They required no answer. The thing was done. However, the man personating the inspector judged it expedient to say roughly, "She shall go soon enough, together with the rest of you." These were the last words belonging to the comedy part of this affair. Oblivious of everything and everybody, Severin strode towards him and seized the lapels of his coat. Under his thin, bluish cheeks, one could see his jaws working with passion. "You have men posted outside. Get the lady taken home at once. Do you hear? Now, before you try to get hold of the man upstairs." "Oh, there is a man upstairs," scoffed the other openly. "Well, he shall be brought down in time to see the end of this." But Severin, beside himself, took no heed of the tone. "Who's the imbecile meddler who sent you blundering here? Didn't you understand your instructions? Don't you know anything? It's incredible. Here." He dropped the lapels of the coat and, plunging his hand into his breast, jerked feverishly at something under his shirt. At last, he produced a small square pocket of soft leather, which must have been hanging like a scapulary from his neck by the tape whose broken ends dangled from his fist. "Look inside," he spluttered, flinging it in the other's face. And instantly he turned round towards the girl. She stood just behind him, perfectly still and silent. Her set, white face gave an illusion of placidity. Only her staring eyes seemed bigger and darker. He spoke rapidly, with nervous assurance. I heard him distinctly promise her to make everything as clear as daylight presently, but that was all I caught. He stood close to her, never attempting to touch her, even with the tip of his little finger, and she stared at him stupidly. For a moment, however, her eyelids descended slowly, pathetically, And then, with the long black eyelashes lying on her white cheeks, she looked ready to fall down in a swoon, but she never even swayed where she stood. He urged her loudly to follow him at once and walked towards the door at the bottom of the cellar stairs without looking behind him. And, as a matter of fact, she did move after him a pace or two. But of course, he was not allowed to reach the door. There were angry exclamations, a short, fierce scuffle. Flung away violently, he came flying backwards upon her and fell. She threw out her arms in a gesture of dismay and stepped aside, just clear of his head, which struck the ground heavily near her shoe. He grunted with the shock. By the time he had picked himself up, slowly, dazedly, he was awake to the reality of things. The man into whose hands he had thrust the leather case had extracted therefrom a narrow strip of bluish paper. He held it up above his head, and, as after the scuffle, an expectant, uneasy stillness reigned once more, he threw it down disdainfully with the words, "I think, comrades, that this proof was hardly necessary." Quick as thought, the girl stooped after the fluttering slip. Holding it spread out in both hands, she looked at it, then, without raising her eyes, opened her fingers slowly and let it fall. I examined that curious document afterwards. It was signed by a very high personage and stamped and countersigned by other high officials in various countries of Europe. In his trade, or shall I say, in his mission, that sort of talisman might have been necessary, no doubt. Even to the police itself, all but the heads, he had been known only as Severin, the noted anarchist. He hung his head, biting his lower lip. A change had come over him, a sort of thoughtful, absorbed calmness. Nevertheless, he panted. His sides worked visibly, and his nostrils expanded and collapsed in weird contrast with his sombre aspect of a fanatical monk in a meditative attitude, but with something, too, in his face of an actor intent upon the terrible exigencies of his part. Before him, Horn declaimed, haggard and bearded, like an inspired denunciatory prophet from a wilderness. Two fanatics. They were made to understand each other. Does this surprise you? I suppose you think that such people would be foaming at the mouth and snarling at each other. I protested hastily that I was not surprised in the least, that I thought nothing of the kind, that anarchists in general were simply inconceivable to me mentally, morally, logically, sentimentally, and even physically. X received this declaration with his usual woodenness and went on. Horn had burst out into eloquence. While pouring out scornful invective, he let tears escape from his eyes and roll down his black beard unheeded. Severin panted quicker and quicker. When he opened his mouth to speak, everyone hung on his words. "Don't be a fool, Horn," he began. "You know very well that I have done this for none of the reasons you are throwing at me." And in a moment he became outwardly as steady as a rock under the other's lurid stare. "I have been thwarting, deceiving, and betraying you from conviction." He turned his back on Horn and, addressing the girl, repeated the words, "From conviction." It's extraordinary how cold she looked. I suppose she could not think of any appropriate gesture. There can have been few precedents indeed for such a situation. "Clear as daylight," he added. "Do you understand what that means? From conviction." And still she did not stir. She did not know what to do, but the luckless wretch was about to give her the opportunity for a beautiful and correct gesture. "I have felt in me the power to make you share this conviction," he protested, ardently. He had forgotten himself. He made a step towards her. Perhaps he stumbled. To me, he seemed to be stooping low as if to touch the hem of her garment. And then the appropriate gesture came. She snatched her skirt away from his polluting contact and averted her head with an upward tilt. It was magnificently done, this gesture of conventionally unstained honor, of an unblemished, high-minded amateur. Nothing could have been better, and he seemed to think so too, for once more he turned away. But this time he faced no one. He was again panting frightfully, while he fumbled hurriedly in his waistcoat pocket and then raised his hand to his lips. There was something furtive in this movement. But directly afterwards his bearing changed. His laboured breathing gave him a resemblance to a man who had just run a desperate race. But a curious air of detachment, of sudden and profound indifference, replaced the strain of the striving effort. The race was over. I did not want to see what would happen next. I was only too well aware. I tucked the young lady's arm under mine without a word and made my way with her to the stairs. Her brother walked behind us. Halfway up the short flight, she seemed unable to lift her feet high enough for the steps, and we had to pull and push to get her to the top. In the passage, she dragged herself along, hanging on my arm, helplessly bent like an old woman. We issued into an empty street through a half-open door, staggering like besotted revellers. At the corner, we stopped a four-wheeler, and the ancient driver looked round from his box with morose scorn at our efforts to get her in. Twice during the drive, I felt her collapse on my shoulder in a half-faint. Facing us, the youth in knickerbockers remained as mute as a fish, until he jumped out with the latchkey, sat more still than I would have believed it possible. At the door of their drawing room, she left my arm and walked in first, catching at the chairs and tables. She unpinned her hat, then, exhausted with the effort, her cloak still hanging from her shoulders, flung herself into a deep armchair, sideways, her face half buried in a cushion. The good brother appeared silently before her with a glass of water. She motioned it away. He drank it himself and walked off to a distant corner, behind the grand piano, somewhere. All was still in this room where I had seen, for the first time, Severin, the anti-anarchist, captivated and spellbound by the consummate and hereditary grimaces that in a certain sphere of life take the place of feelings with an excellent effect. I suppose her thoughts were busy with the same memory. Her shoulders shook violently. A pure attack of nerves. When it quieted down, she affected firmness. What is done to a man of that sort? What will they do to him? Nothing. They can do nothing to him, I assured her with perfect truth. I was pretty certain he had died in less than 20 minutes from the moment his hand had gone to his lips. For if his fanatical anti-anarchism went even as far as carrying poison in his pocket only to rob his adversaries of legitimate vengeance, I knew he would take care to provide something that would not fail him when required. She drew an angry breath. There were red spots on her cheeks and a feverish brilliance in her eyes. Has ever anyone been exposed to such a terrible experience? To think that he had held my hand! That man! Her face twitched. She gulped down a pathetic sob. If I ever felt sure of anything, it was of Severin's high-minded motives. Then she began to weep quietly, which was good for her. Then, through her flood of tears, half resentful, what was it he said to me? From conviction. It seemed a vile mockery. What could he mean by it? That, my dear young lady, I said gently, is more than I or anybody else can ever explain to you. Mr. X flicked a crumb off the front of his coat, and that was strictly true as to her, though Horn, for instance, understood very well, and so did I, especially after we had been to Severin's lodging in a dismal back street of an intensely respectable quarter. Horn was known there as a friend, and we had no difficulty in being admitted, the slatternly maid merely remarking, as she let us in, that Mr. Severin had not been home that night. We forced open a couple of drawers in the way of duty, and found a little useful information. The most interesting part was his diary, for this man, engaged in such deadly work, had the weakness to keep a record of the most damnatory kind. There were his acts, and also his thoughts laid bare to us, but the dead don't mind that. They don't mind anything. From conviction. Yes. A vague but ardent humanitarianism had urged him in his first youth into the bitterest extremity of negation and revolt. Afterwards, his optimism flinched. He doubted and became lost. You have heard of converted atheists. These turn often into dangerous fanatics, but the soul remains the same. After he had got acquainted with the girl, there are to be met in that diary of his very queer politico-amorous rhapsodies. He took her sovereign grimaces with deadly seriousness. He longed to convert her. But all this cannot interest you. For the rest, I don't know if you remember, it is a good many years ago now, the journalistic sensation of the Herion Street mystery, the finding of a man's body in the cellar of an empty house, the inquest, some arrests, many surmises, then silence, the usual end for many obscure martyrs and confessors. The fact is, he was not enough of an optimist. You must be a savage, tyrannical, pitiless, thick and thin optimist, like Horn, for instance, to make a good social rebel of the extreme type. He rose from the table. A waiter hurried up with his overcoat. Another held his hat in readiness. "But what became of the young lady?" I asked. "Do you really want to know?" he said, buttoning himself in his fur coat carefully. I confessed to the small malice of sending her Severin's diary. She went into retirement, then she went to Florence, then she went into retreat in a convent. I can't tell where she will go next. What does it matter? Gestures, gestures, mere gestures of her class. He fitted on his glossy high hat with extreme precision, and casting a rapid glance round the room, full of well-dressed people innocently dining, muttered between his teeth, "And nothing else. That is why their kind is fated to perish." I never met Mr. X again after that evening. I took to dining at my club. On my next visit to Paris, I found my friend all impatience to hear of the effect produced on me by this rare item of his collection. I told him all the story, and he beamed on me with the pride of his distinguished specimen. "Isn't X well worth knowing?" he bubbled over in great delight. "He's unique, amazing, absolutely terrific." His enthusiasm grated upon my finer feelings. I told him curtly that the man's cynicism was simply abominable. "Oh, abominable, abominable," assented my friend effusively. "And then, he likes to have his little joke sometimes," he added in a confidential tone. I fail to understand the connection of this last remark. I've been utterly unable to discover where in all this the joke comes in.